Hello, welcome everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for joining our webinar. We have a number of folks who are joining, and we will get started in just one moment. We have a pretty heavy agenda, and so we will not wait for everyone to attend. And then, in terms of a few housekeeping notes, we will be sharing both the slides from this session as well as the video recording of this for those who are not able to join live. I will kick us off. First of all, my name is Dan Osuski. I'm the Chief Research Officer at IFVI. I will be joined by a suite of speakers across the organizations of IFVI and VBA as a part of this webinar. That will include my colleagues Michael, Fran, Carter, Tamsin, and Ryan. You will have the opportunity to see each of them speak a bit momentarily. Let me walk us through our agenda for the session today, and then share a few opening remarks for us before we dive into what is really the main purpose of the day, which is to provide a bit of introductory context to 3 new methodology statements that have been released and are currently available for public comment. And so we will begin with an overview of general methodology 2, then followed by 2 of our topic methodologies, the first being on the social impact topic of occupational health and safety, and then the second being the environmental topic of water consumption. We will then wrap things up with a few closing remarks. Within each of these particular topics, we will provide a bit of a presentation and overview, and then create space for question and answer. So please, as you are listening and reflecting on the content that we are sharing, feel free to share any questions that you have in the question and answer function of the webinar. I will point out that there are 2 functions. There is a chat function and a Q&A function. We would request that you share those questions in the Q&A function specifically. So to give a little bit of introductory context for us all, it's been about 2 years now since the official partnership of the 2 organizations who are represented speaking on this call, which is the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts and the Value Balancing Alliance. And the purpose of the partnership between these 2 nonprofit organizations was to create a public good, globally applicable impact accounting methodology that can be available for companies, investors, and other stakeholders to measure, manage, and improve their social and environmental impacts. Our mission, collectively, in addition to producing this methodology, is to really help build and scale the practice of impact accounting in a way that can ultimately promote decision-making that can be based not just on the traditional paradigms of risk and return, but also risk, return, and impact. And so collectively, our grand vision and our goal is to create a just and sustainable economy that can serve and enhance the well-being of people while simultaneously safeguarding the environment. A little bit of an intro to what impact accounting is. The fundamental idea behind impact accounting is it takes what can be considered sort of traditional metrics in the social and environmental impact or sustainability space, and it produces information based off of that type of data that can be comparable across entities, focused on the actual outcomes and impacts of the entity, and is comparable across different topics of impact, as well as can serve a bridge to comparison to an organization's financial performance as well. And so the way that works is a methodology for impact accounting is built off of this concept of an impact pathway, where specific impact drivers of a company, those are traditionally the types of metrics that are collected for sustainability reporting purposes, can be identified to create links to actual impacts on people's well-being. And through cutting edge research, available information, it's possible to link that information to what those impacts are and then attach a specific value to it that is produced in a currency form to enable this broad comparability. And so as an input for an organization who's interested in applying impact accounting, For the most part, what that organization is doing is collecting very similar metrics to what is already done for the purposes of sustainability reporting, and then applies the methodologies that we are talking about today to that information to produce that impact information in a monetary form that can be more decision useful, more comparable, and drive some real additional insights compared to what are some of the traditional sustainability and impact metrics in the space. At the core of what IFVI and VBA are doing in the development of their methodology is really recognizing the importance of an overall process to develop these methodologies that can signal credibility and usefulness to the market. And so the methodology that we are developing is overseen by an independent governance body that we refer to as the VTPC, that is the Valuation Technical Practitioner Committee, and follows a due process protocol to provide the information to that VTPC to ultimately make the judgments about what is the substance and content of the methodologies that are being produced. That is one of the reasons why we are having this webinar today. A part of that due process protocol is ensuring that as drafts of the methodology are developed, we are engaging experts to inform that methodology and then releasing them to the public in the form of an exposure draft where all interested stakeholders are able to review and provide their input to those drafts for further revision prior to finalization of the methodology. And so the purpose of this webinar is to share information about these exposure drafts and really encourage all of you to provide your input to make sure that your voice is heard as a part of this process. There are a number of methodologies that are already available through the partnership of VBA and IFVI. And so I want to give a bit of a preview of the suite of resources and methodologies that are currently available on the market through this partnership. There has been a recent release of what are referred to as interim methodologies across a number of environmental topics, all of which are currently available for use for those who are interested in adopting impact accounting, while at the same time, as I was just referring, we are developing through our due process protocol official methodologies through the due process and this public comment period. And so specifically for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to hone in on a few of these specific methodologies available. That is the topic of General Methodology 2, as I just shared, water consumption and occupational health and safety. And so as a part of our session, like I said, we're going to provide a bit of an overview of each of these topics. We're going to create some space for question and answer. We are also going to utilize some survey functions to sort of create an interactive opportunity for you to provide some initial reflections on what we've been sharing. And so we're gonna pilot that out first of all with a basic question just to understand who is in the room with us today. And so we have a poll here that is to ask, what is your experience with impact accounting? You can follow the QR code or the link that's being shared in the chat to submit your response, and there will be a handful of these polls throughout the session, and so you feel free to keep your Mentimeter up for future questions as well. This is great. We'll give it another moment for any further responses. It's really nice to see a nice balance of audience members across the board. We've got some folks who are here just learning about impact accounting for the first time, which is great. Welcome. Happy to also have some follow-up sessions for those of you who are really keen on getting some more of the background of this work. We've got the highest percentage who are familiar with it, but would acknowledge that they are still learning. And then we've got a number of folks who would put themselves in both the expert category or at least the practitioner category of folks who have already been applying this to some degree. And so before I hand it over to Michael to start us on the topic of GM2, I'd first like to say welcome to all of you, no matter the degree of expertise or familiarity you have to these topics. We feel like it is actually quite essential that we receive the feedback from all of these different levels of expertise and experience through our public comment periods. And so we welcome you regardless of whether you feel like you are just in a learning stage or are at that expert stage to really dive into this content and provide your feedback, because ultimately this is still meant to be applicable and usable by all of you. And so thank you, welcome, and I will now hand it over to Michael to continue our conversation.
Thank you, Dan, and also hello from my side. So happy to kick it off with the general methodology 2, which is the second of our more general statements. And the purpose of this statement is really to create transparency to guide the development of our topic and industry-specific methodologies. So really providing more details on the data collection, on the methods that we're using to measure and to value our impacts in our impact accounting system. And basically, we have two audiences for which those are like meant. So this is like on the one hand, the developers of standardized impact pathways, so really developing these topic methodologies, or the preparer also of impact accounts. And the key aspect here also is to really help selecting the most suitable methods to really then have a comparable measurement and valuation of impacts. And really trying to not be already like exhaustive here in our list that we provide, but we assume that this will also evolve as the impact accounting system will evolve over time. And it builds on the definitions, on the concepts, as well as the principles that we're like setting out in our first general methodology statement, which is the conceptual framework for impact accounting. When we look at the general approach that we're taking here, you can see it on the right-hand side in the figure. We're following something that we call the impact pathway. So looking at inputs, outputs, outcomes, and impacts. And we can more or less like distinguish 3 steps in the statement and like the guidance on developing topic methodologies. By first looking at the impact drivers, so inputs and outputs, and the required data that basically goes into the impact pathway by looking into like the data also that is required, for example, from reporting. And linking it to the outcomes and impacts, so the changes in well-being basically that we can then measure and that are the ultimate goal of like the impact pathway to really determine the impacts, so these changes in well-being. And those changes then get in the end get like valued in monetary terms, so to really reflect the preferences of individuals to make sure that those become then comparable across topics. And here, in case of like the a topic is maybe not yet available also for preparers of impact accounting, these general guidances can help to then also create additional impact pathways that really like cover those topics that are not yet available as standardized methodologies. And the key proposals now are introduced by my colleague Ryan.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Ryan Dalton. I'm the research manager at IFVI. I will go over 3 of the key proposals in the GM2 statement, and then I'll quickly summarize the questions that we are asking your feedback on. So key proposal number 1 relates to the role of well-being in impact accounting. So I'll start by saying that in the methodology, the outcomes and impacts that Dan mentioned in an impact pathway are defined by dimensions of well-being. So well-being is really important. Essentially, if you're looking at any impact pathway, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions, water consumption, or OHS, the end quantity that's being measured by that impact pathway is well-being. So let me take you back to the general methodology 1 statement very quickly as a refresher. So the definition of an outcome is outcomes are used to describe the 1 or more dimensions of people's well-being that are affected by an entity, by input or output data. And then an impact is a change in 1 or more of those dimensions of people's well-being, or through a change in the condition of the natural environment. So you can see in the General Methodology 1 statement, we referred to dimensions of well-being. It is now in the General Methodology 2 statement where we actually define what we mean by well-being and provide a framework so we can describe outcomes and impacts in detail. So some of the key proposals in this section of the statement include, one, that the OECD well-being framework is the default framework to describe dimensions of well-being in the methodology. I'll go over the framework in a second. It's shown at the right. The second proposal is, as I mentioned, what is ultimately measured by impact accounting, the end quantity, are changes in people's well-being. So when we describe well-being, we use the OECD well-being framework, which is broken into current well-being dimensions, which is shown at the top of figure 2, and then resources for future well-being, which is shown at the bottom of figure 2. The OECD well-being framework was selected for a number of reasons, and the technical staff put a lot of research into framing exactly how to apply the framework. But an important one is, as you can see, there are connections established to the impact management ecosystem, specifically connections to capitals. So you can see different types of capitals are resources for future well-being. We can go to the next proposal. The second proposal is how to describe outcomes, so creating well-defined outcomes. And then once those outcomes have been well-defined, how to determine whether they should be included in an impact pathway or not included in an impact pathway. To make that decision, we apply an impact materiality filter. So let me break that down a little bit. So first, the process of clearly defining outcomes determines what is included in impact accounts. So this stage is really important. While impact drivers establish connections between the company and the impact, and monetary valuation turns all of the impacts into a commensurable monetary unit, it is the well-defined outcome stage where we actually set the scope and decide what is included in an impact pathway. So some of the proposals in this section are, one, that each outcome that we define should be well-defined. We do that by naming two things: the dimensions of well-being, so all of the dimensions from the prior slide from the OECD framework that are affected, and then we also name the affected stakeholder, which could be an individual, group of people, or society in general. A second proposal is we then use the qualitative characteristic of relevance to assess whether to include that outcome in an impact pathway or to not include. A quick refresher from General Methodology 1. Impact materiality is understood as an entity-specific aspect of relevance. So materiality is specific to each entity or each company, and we use three different variables to decide whether something is material. One, it's the significance of the impact. How big is it? What is the scale or scope on the person who's harmed or benefited? Two, how useful is the information that stems from the impact? Can companies affect outcomes by making different decisions? And then three, is there a societal expectation for transparency and accountability related to that impact or topic? Applying that specifically to both well-being dimensions and then affected stakeholders, sort of the two parts of a well-defined outcome. One, for each well-being dimension, it's fairly straightforward. You measure the significance. If it's bigger, it's probably more material. If it's less significant, it's less material. For affected stakeholders, there are a couple of different ways we can analyze whether an affected stakeholder is material. One, degree of separation. How many degrees of separation are there between the entity and the affected stakeholder? Is it direct or is it a third degree separation, for instance? Two, is the affected stakeholder society in general? There are some issues that are diffuse in nature, affected by a lot of different social and political systems, and because of that, it may be less material for the entity. We can go to the next key proposal. And the last key proposal I'll highlight in the statement is the considerations we are proposing for selecting evaluation technique. So monetary valuation translates well-being into monetary terms. And there are several well-established techniques that already exist that are shown in Figure 4 that can be used to value an impact. Specific proposals in this section are that evaluation techniques should be selected that best captures the preferences of the affected stakeholders. So the affected stakeholders that are impacted, the monetary evaluation should reflect their preferences. And two, a technique should be selected using the fundamental qualitative characteristics of first, faithful representation, and then in cases of deciding between different techniques, comparability, verifiability, and understandability, as well as all of the considerations in the green box. So these are additional considerations that should be reflected upon when deciding on evaluation technique. One, does the technique capture all of the economic value of the affected stakeholder, meaning their full willingness to pay? Certainty, measurement uncertainty is not inherently a problem. It exists in all of impact measurement. But if all else equal, evaluation factor is more certain, that one should be chosen over the other. The quality of the proxy. So a value factor should serve as a reasonable interpretation of an individual's preferences. And then is the technique commonly used and accepted? Can go to the next slide. So the last thing I'll mention are the 5 questions that we are requesting feedback for as part of the public comment period. One is on the overall usability of the statement. Questions 2, 3, and 4 connect directly to the 3 proposals I just mentioned. 2 being the OECD Wellbeing Framework and its role in the methodology. 3 being well-defined outcomes and impact materiality. And 4 being value factors and impact accounting. And 5 is more of an open-ended additional feedback question. I'll turn it back to Dan, who I believe has another poll question.
Thank you, Ryan and Michael. So I will again encourage people to both share their questions in the question and answer section of the webinar platform. And I will also kick off an additional survey where we are curious for any initial reactions on the proposal that was shared regarding the application of well-being in the methodology. I'm seeing what I think is a not surprising indication of a desire to spend a little bit more time reviewing the exposure draft, with some responses also indicating that based off of what they've heard, at least, the application is clear, and then a smaller amount, but still existing some potential feedback that we might see on the proposal that's been shared and how additional clarity might be required. And so it would be really welcoming to hear any further suggestions on that as we continue through the rest of the public comment period. I will kick us off with a few questions, but before I do that, Ryan and Michael, if there's any other commentary that you'd like to share about the survey results. Great. I will continue to encourage people to share their questions in the Q&A. I will kick things off with a question for the two of you, which is, could you all provide a little bit more clarity about what are the differences between GM1 and GM2, and how ultimately would you want to share to the public, how should they think about using these 2 particular methodology statements?
Michael, maybe I'll take it, and then certainly feel free to chime in if I miss anything. Sure. So I think the key difference is that general methodology 1 establishes more of the qualitative concepts, principles, definitions. That's where we do work such as laying out the 5 qualitative characteristics. And we define things such as what is an impact. General methodology 2 really provides the tools, the toolkit, the quantitative. How do you infer or extrapolate impact driver data? What are the different methods, objective and subjective well-being methods for measuring changes in well-being? And then if I were using them, I think first and foremost, the goal is to read general methodologies to better understand how topic methodologies are developed. We really walk through the process pretty methodically. I think second is in those instances in which topic methodologies or industry-specific methodologies don't yet exist, because we're still working on them, then you could use the general methodology certainly to develop your own impact pathways in a way that's coherent and consistent with with the IFVI and VBA methodology.
Maybe
Thanks,
also
Ryan.
one small addition, maybe also from my end with regards to GM2. So here, as Ryan mentioned, we are looking at the toolkit, and like one key aspect of the toolkit is also like really translating then existing metrics into monetary values. So having guidance also on like how that is done, that's like one of the key aspects also of the general methodology too, to really allow for that last step also that goes even beyond the impact pathway itself.
Thank you both. We have another question here. A question of, is significance of the impact exactly the same as severity of the impact as articulated in ESRS? And does it contain actual impacts or also potential impacts?
Ryan, you want to go on that one first?
Sure, happy to. So we really follow directly ESRS's approach to significance. So when we say significance, it includes for actual impacts the same thing as severity. For potential impacts, it includes severity times the likelihood of the impact. So it's significance sits at the top, and you have severity and likelihood. Severity is further broken down into scale, scope, and irremediable character, but really the language and the application is the same as ESRS.
Thank you. You already anticipated a follow-up question, which is about a word that I have a very difficult time pronouncing, which is irremediability, and so you've already covered that. Thank you. There's one other question that I will ask. There's a request for a potential example of the notion of the dimension of well-being is more relevant as the significance of the impact increases. Would it be possible to sort of provide an illustration of what that looks like?
Yes, sure. So let's take like one of the typical dimensions that you can find in many of our impact pathways, which is like health, or like human health in that sense. And especially when we are looking at like the significance of that impact. So there are phenomena that are like actually affecting a lot of people. So let's take the climate change and GHG emissions causing it as like one example. We have like global coverage of that. So we have like a massive scope of that that's influence, and therefore like one of those elements of significance definitely like is then very high, especially also on like the human health of people that are like affected by extreme weather events, by like rising mean temperature and like all of those following effects, basically.
I will give it a moment for any further questions before we move things over to our next topic. But if there's, I'll also create some space, Michael, Ryan, if there's anything else you'd like to add. And then otherwise, we will prepare to move to our next topic. All righty. Thank you all for sharing, and thanks to the audience for those questions. We will now take the opportunity to move to now what is the first of the topic methodologies that we'd like to talk about, and I will hand it over to Fran.
Thank you, Dan. First of all, I would like to echo one of the comments in the chat. I agree that irremediability is one of the most difficult words to pronounce, especially if you're a non-native speaker. But well, let's speak about occupational health and safety. This is our second topic methodology from the social dimension. As Dan mentioned, we have the public exposure period open until the 7th of September. And the purpose of the methodology is to measure and value the impacts related to occupational injuries, illnesses, and fatalities, and also to guide preparers in the process of measuring and value these impacts. The impact pathway, as we saw before, all the topic methodologies use the impact pathway as a central piece of methodology development. In this case, the impact pathway do a causal link between the OHS incidents that result in injuries, illnesses, and fatalities with outcomes and impacts on the well-being of people. The results of this topic methodology, we hope, is that they can be used by users of impact information, so potentially by you, the audience, and whether if you are a manager of your entity, an investor, or an affected stakeholder, to manage sustainability-related risk, opportunities, and impacts, but also whenever you have to assess or take decisions regarding how an entity contributes to sustainability. Having said this, if we go to the next slide, here we will be able to see the impact pathway of the OHS methodology. This impact pathway, as we said, connects the impact drivers with the outcomes and impacts, so with well-being. In this case, the impact drivers are related to the labor provided by the workers. These workers are in a workplace and they are exposed to OHS hazards. So in the end, we have as outputs the injuries, illnesses, and fatalities. To measure these impact drivers, we're focusing on reporting indicators, and we are having data requirements related to OHS incidents, to lost work days, and to the workers' compensation insurance rates. We recognize that this impact pathway is not only applicable for own operations, so there are also OHS hazards in your value chain, so upstream and downstream, and we recognize that data requirements there have to be simplified, mainly because there's more complexity in obtaining those data points, so there are simplified data requirements in that case. These requirements, as I said, aims to be aligned with ESRS, with the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, with ES S111 of social protection, and especially with S114, but also with the Global Reporting Initiative standards, specifically the standard 403 on occupational health and safety. So once we have the impact drivers identified and measured, we go to the outcomes, and there are two well-being dimensions from the OECD framework that are mainly affected by OHS incidents. First one, we have health, but we also have the income and wealth dimension. And we have two capitals that impact on the resources for future well-being that are affected, which are human capital and economic capital. When we consider this, there are three distinct impacts that are included in the draft. The first one is the human health impacts related to the pain and suffering that the workers have due to injuries, illnesses, and fatalities. There's a decrease in the workers' quality of life and the intrinsic value of a life. We also have the healthcare cost. This refers to the uncompensated medical and rehabilitation costs borne by workers and society. And we also have the lost wages. We have the fact that a worker won't be able to work and also have the associated fringe benefits related to work. But having said this, now it's time to hand it to Tamsin to know the key proposals of the exposure draft.
Thanks, Fran. I'll go over three key proposals in the OHS methodology. The first is the use of conventional OHS metrics as a foundation. By conventional, I'm referring to number of recordable incidents, number of lost workdays. These are very common metrics that have been embedded for a long time in national regulations around health and safety in the workplace, in international and regional reporting standards, sustainability reporting standards, and industry practice by OHS managers, risk managers. But what the methodology does is quite interesting. Lost workdays has a history as a productivity metric, but in the exposure draft, it is used instead as repurposed as a measure of incident severity. And this is done to ultimately make that link between conventional metrics on one hand and well-being impacts on the other hand, including human health and healthcare cost impacts. This transformation is made possible by leveraging social science research displayed here from the UK Health and Safety Executive, from Safe Work Australia, and from EU OSHA that have made that crucial link between lost workdays and different health state severities and different levels of healthcare costs. And so this proposal is really about how can we shift the focus from productivity to well-being impacts while still aligning with companies' prevailing practices of reporting on recordable incidents and number of lost workdays. Next proposal. Our next slide, please. On the next key proposal is on modified data requirements for value chain workers. In an ideal scenario where the data are available, the same data requirements should be used for value chain workers as for an entity's own workforce. Of course, data limitations do exist, and so the exposure draft proposes a number of modifications that are available for value chain workers. In this table on the right, you can see just a few rows of data required from the entity when it comes to value chain workers, and many variables can actually be filled in using secondary sources for value chain workers. You can see on the right a number of data sources from the ILO. I'm really happy to share that the exposure draft itself provides a spreadsheet of readily usable secondary data sources. That's Appendix B, if you want to download that and give it a try, where we have collected those variables for you. And where that data has not been collected, we actually give the URLs to databases like the ILO World Social Protection Database, where you can look up your country and find the relevant variable to fill in these variables. So some examples of these variables where modifications are available for value chain workers. Preparers may use the total number of recordable OHS incidents among value chain workers without breaking down those incidents by type, so illness and injury, and severity, temporary, long-term incapacitations, and fatalities. It is preferred that there is a breakdown by fatal and non-fatal, but if that data are not available, those types of severity distributions can be assumed based on ILO statistics by country and industry. Likewise, percent of insured workers may also be assumed based on ILO statistics by country. What that refers to is the percent of value chain workers who are covered by workers' compensation insurance. And finally, median wages ideally would be, again, provided specific to the value chain entity, but if that's not available, may be assumed based on country and industry specific wage statistics. And that's specifically for the lost wages component of the impact pathway. Okay, next slide. Our third key proposal is our approach to measuring and valuing human health impacts. Human health impacts are often the number one impact for an OHS impact pathway, and was very important to be included for faithful representation here. The proposed approach is based on an aggregated estimate of how people value health. You may have heard of the term value of a statistical life, or VSL. It's a quite common technique that is used by a number of governments around the world. The proposed VSL estimate in the OHS exposure draft is from the OECD's 2012 meta-analysis that brings together hundreds of estimates of the VSL from around the world. And a couple of the source documents shown here on the right. Important note, that meta-analysis is expected to be updated next year, after which this exposure draft or this methodology is also expected to be updated to incorporate that. An important methodological choice that was made is a single globally representative VSL is used on equity grounds and to avoid biased results when assessing impacts across countries. For example, when a company has operations in multiple countries, or if an investor is assessing portfolio companies that are spread across the world, wanting to make those comparisons in an unbiased way. Why does this happen? VSLs the literature does find that higher income populations have higher valuations for health, lower income populations have lower valuations for health. Does that mean that a lower income person's health and life is worth less? No, that's the methodology makes the determination to remove that variation, that income variation, by using a single globally representative VSL instead. However, context-specific VSLs can be incredibly useful in complementary analysis and could be appropriate, for example, if a company is operating in one country and wants to use a nationally representative VSL there. Okay. So we've put out a number of questions for public comment. In addition to all of these questions, question 6 is anything else? Anything else that comes to mind as you read the exposure draft, we're incredibly interested in hearing. So question 1, we've asked about the overall usability of the methodology. 2, the scope. As we've covered, the OHS methodology includes healthcare costs, and lost wages impacts. Are those sufficient? Are those the most significant impacts for affected stakeholders? 3rd, what I've covered today, data feasibility for value chain workers. Are those modifications sufficient to make the methodology applicable to, or rather feasible for value chain workers? 4th, addressing systemic underreporting of incidents. This is a very prevalent issue. We've proposed a way to handle that in Appendix E. 5th, approaches to health and healthcare cost valuation. One of those issues is the single globally representative VSL, and 6, additional feedback. Great. I think with that, I'll hand it over to Dan.
Thanks, Tamsin. We are going to do another poll. Then we've got a few questions that we can start fielding as well. We'll give it a moment as responses are coming through. We've got a few responses, I think, similar to our question before, which is folks who are not sure or have potential other views on this particular question regarding the balance of feasibility and precision within the sort of assumptions that Tamsin was talking about in some of the proposals. Not surprisingly, for those folks who are not sure, I think this is an opportunity for us to plug. It's a great way to dive back into the methodology statements themselves, review them in more detail, and think about their feedback. We also do have a number of responses that are indicating that, at least based on what has been heard so far, that there isn't this nice balance between feasibility and precision. And then, of course, we have a few responses that are in the middle at this stage, which is more closely to conventional OHS metrics in sustainability standards, and then other feedback to actually use better measures of severity being added. That's something that I think in general we're usually not surprised by with some of these sort of decisions that can be made along spectrums. There's some feedback around the way to find the right balance. There's other feedback around emphasizing different directions of sort of prioritization between that balance. Tamsin and Fran, if you would like to share any other reflections on the question or the responses here. If not, I will start to pose some questions that we've received. Great. I'm going to start with the first question, which I love, and it's sort of pulling back to a broader point, because I think we use this language across a number of our methodologies. And so Tamsin and Fran, if you'd like to potentially pitch this over to Ryan or Michael, I think you have the ability to do that. The question is, what do we mean by entity whenever we are referring to the entity?
It's a great question. And I do think Ryan would be best positioned to answer this based on General Methodology 1. If I can bring you in.
Yeah, of course. So by entity, we refer to a corporation or a business. I suppose there are other ancillary applications where it could be a government or a government agency or nonprofit, but by and large, we're referring to a business.
Thank you, Ryan. The next question that came up is Tamsin, in part of your overview, you talked a little bit about the equity considerations for the usage of a VSL for the human health impact. There's a similar potential challenge on the lost wages side of things, which is a lost wage in potentially a more impoverished place of the world could appear less impactful than a lost wage in other places of the world where those wage impacts just are different. Can you share anything about how the methodology sort of thinks about that or approaches that?
It's such an excellent question, and it is important to split out the impact pathway into those 3 different branches that we have, where it's human health, healthcare costs, and lost wages. And I will say that for that first bucket, human health, it became very clear to us from the desk research that was done and the interviews with experts and other research that we did in the process of developing the methodology in consultation with under the guidance of the VTPC, that for health valuation, equity considerations are really top of mind. It is true that for the healthcare cost and lost wage components, a global normalization factor is not included in the methodology. And so the scale of impacts is different across different countries. And that would be really interesting to hear feedback on during the public comment period, whether there are folks, practitioners who are doing impact accounting who have similarly done a global normalization adjustment for a health aspect and not for financial aspects, or if they have done it for both and reasons for each. Yeah. Any other?
Thanks,
oh, sorry, I was just going to turn to Fran if there was any other comments that you might have had to add on.
No, I totally agree, and I was going to defer to the fact that we are doing it in the human health dimension. So there, as you were including the example of a broken arm has the same human health impact wherever you are. In the income and wealth dimensions, when we enter in market prices, the evaluation is different, but I refer to what Tamsin said. The fact that market differences are affecting that valuation is something that we are very concerned as well, and we would be very happy to know more about examples or potential alternatives there as well.
Thank you. We have another question that I will share. That is something that I know we've talked about to some degree as we were developing the impact pathway, which is does this impact pathway focus specifically on the individual employee only as the affected stakeholder? Would it exclude other impacts, for instance, on family or other colleagues, which could be significant?
Right. It's an excellent question. I would give a more nuanced answer. Perhaps it's both a yes and a no. And I would say on the yes side, when thinking about the VSL, for instance, and when people are providing evaluation for health in the many VSL studies that have been used and that undergird this methodology, you know, those valuations are based on a number of considerations that people are making when answering stated preference surveys, for instance. And those considerations can include their role in their family and their role in their community, and not being able to fulfill those social roles is a part of that health impact that they are thinking about when responding to evaluation contingent valuation survey or what have you, choice modeling, et cetera. So theoretically, in that sense, yes. I would say in another sense, the answer can also be no, in that valuations provided by friends and family members and co-workers are not explicitly included in this impact pathway. And I'll call out a specific section of the exposure draft, sections 1 and 2, I believe, that describe the scope and the nature of this topic, speak directly to what's included and what's not included. And those societal knock-on effects on friends and family are profoundly important impacts. That is acknowledged readily by the methodology. At the same time, this also harkens back to the presentation earlier on general methodology too. Degree of separation is an important consideration when thinking about the total scope of an impact pathway in each of these topic methodologies. And so degree of separation can guide the impact pathway to exclude certain indirect knock-on effects that happen as a result of an incident that befalls a direct worker. For instance, the economic knock-on effects of a loss of wages then means that that spending is not happening in the economy, so on and so forth. That affects layers and layers of other entities beyond the individual entity, right? Where are those bounds being drawn? Ultimately, the topic methodologies look to the general methodology to help define that boundary.
Thank you. I will encourage folks to share any more questions. I will ask one more of Fran and Tamsin, and if there's no other questions that come through in the chat, we will transition over to our final topic. The question is sort of lifting up to the practicality of this. How would you all articulate? Do you envision companies, investors actually using the occupational health and safety methodology?
Love this question, and I would also point to public comment question number 1 on usability to hear from public commenters themselves on how they might envision using the methodology. I would say for corporations, there are a number of uses in corporate management. You can think of retrospectively sustainability, performance, analysis, reporting. Instead of reporting on output level metrics, this topic methodology allows entities to report at the level of impacts and monetized impacts. And so sustainability performance year on year, different country operations of a company can be compared. Prospectively, in the realm of corporate management, the analysis of future acquisitions and mergers and investments that could affect the health and safety of workers could also be analyzed using this impact pathway. On the investor side, a number of interesting use cases as well to assess, again, retrospectively or prospectively, portfolio companies in an existing that investors is currently invested in or looking to invest in, could be based on an OHS track record at the impact level.
Thank you. Fran, anything you'd add to that?
Well, I could just add some use cases that we've seen in the Value Balancing Alliance by some companies. Of course, these results are being used for sustainability management, for instance, as an input for the materiality matrix, for the impact materiality, but also for, as Tamsin was saying, for this like-for-like comparisons, for comparisons between countries, hotspots analysis. But I would say one of the key challenges is the value chain. Probably having robust data on your value chain can be very beneficial, and this methodology gives you another layer, another way of comparing it in a business unit that's very known by the entity's managers, which is having the monetary valuation of the impacts that you're causing in your value chain, I think that can have very important implications for decision making.
Thank you both. Before we move over to the water consumption topic, I want to pull out a theme in some of the responses that both Tamsin and Fran shared, which is a reminder that these are exposure drafts, and while we are providing explanations and responses to these questions, the spirit and purpose of those responses is to invite discussion and feedback. And so please feel free to use this conversation and inform those public comment responses, because the purpose of this public comment period is to really hear from those stakeholders who can identify how we can continue to improve and reflect on the methodologies themselves. And so with that, I will hand it back over to Michael to kick us off on the second topic methodology that we have available for public comment, which is related to water consumption.
Thank you, Dan. So with regards to the water consumption, we really want to understand in how far an entity's really like total consumption of water throughout the value chain then really like leads to changes in well-being through changes in the natural environment. So we really outline in this methodology how this water consumed by entities is linked to impacts and outcomes, and like how we can then really also manage the related risks, opportunities, and of course the impacts of the entity. So by looking into the impact pathway, which is on the next slide, we can really then see how that works. And first of all, when we're talking about water consumption, we're talking about the difference between the water withdrawn and the water discharged. So that's important to like keep in mind when we're talking about water consumption. That's like basically the delta here. And we do not only look at this for like the own operations, but really this is like a methodology that recognizes the water consumption across the value chain. So here, important also that we do by that also allow, similarly, like as Fran mentioned, some hotspot analysis also in the value chain, for example. Important, we do draw from the reporting requirements. So alignment with the reporting requirements is key. And we do expand to a certain degree upon the disclosure requirements from ESRS or GRI, especially for those parts where it's specifically relevant for steering. So really going then more localized, more detailed, more granular. And what we capture then in the pathway, as you can see, is that we do first of all understand the changes in the natural environment. So looking really at like the agricultural outputs and the changes in that, or also other changes in the natural environment, and then link it to the four main impacts that we have captured here. One being the affected health through malnutrition from really like also reduced agricultural yield. The other one being affected by the waterborne diseases the moment you're like having a lack of water, of safe water, like that you can tap into. And the other two being like the ecosystem services which are affected, as well as like also the financial costs to future generations to access water. So this is like really taking these key perspectives and localizing then the value factors, localizing the monetary values that are then displayed and aggregated at the end, and to really multiply that with the water consumed. So really like this delta between water withdrawn and water discharged. And the key proposals of that are now like then introduced by Carter and walking us through the options here.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And thanks everyone for sticking around to the end here. I'm going to walk you through, similar to the other ones, a few key proposals that we're soliciting feedback on through the methodology that sort of go into more detail about some of the things that Michael just highlighted. So the first is that the methodology provides two options for how to use it based on data availability that one has from an entity. And so this is really trying to balance this idea that there is a local context that is really important for understanding water consumption related impacts, while also balancing this idea that data availability may not always be at that level of spatial resolution. And so the preferred option asks for or says to apply the methodology at the most precise geographical unit. And what this really means is, water consumption exists in a city, or at least a state or a province municipality, or even a watershed potentially, and to apply the methodology at that scale, leading to sort of the most representative understanding of water consumption impacts. But on the other side, the minimum option, or sort of the alternative option, when that level of detail is not known, we have national level value factors. So the methodology can be applied at a country level when higher level detail isn't known. And again, this is really trying to balance this trade-off that we're describing here. And it's sort of a reality of the situation of this local context versus data availability. We see this as potentially expanding opportunities to be able to assess particularly value chain impacts where water consumption data may not be known, and just highlighting in the bottom context, one of the largest uses of water consumption globally is agriculture or products sort of coming from nature. And so being able to really start to assess those types of impacts is really valuable to have these two options for. The second proposal, if you go to the next slide, Dan, is how local application of the value factors actually occurs within the methodology. So the goal was really just try to make this an accessible, sort of easy to use process where the methodology presents in the appendix a suite of national value factors that then basically get applied locally using some freely available public scalars that maybe some of you are already familiar with. Those in sustainability reporting, for example. And so the two scalars come from, one, the Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas, and then secondly, the biodiversity risk filter that comes from the WWF. And so what these do is, you may know that your water consumption is in a certain location, and you'll go to one of these tools. They're very easy to use. You can pretty much just put a point down on a map. It'll give you the value that you will then multiply by the value factors in the methodology. The water stress from the Water Risk Atlas gets multiplied by the malnutrition and waterborne disease, or these health-related impacts. And the local biodiversity pressure from the biodiversity risk filter gets applied to the ecosystem services category. Again, the goal here is that this allows for increased accuracy and representation by providing these fairly precise location-based value factors using these scalars that are sort of freely and publicly available through these reputable sources. And the third proposal is then, now that you have the value factors from these four different categories, how do we take those value factors and put them together into a single sort of site-specific value factor that can be multiplied by your water consumption? And so the methodology specifically proposes to take the highest of the three what are called near-term impacts, and to then add this value to the fourth impact, which is the long-term impact of financial cost to access future water. And so let me explain a little bit of why this is. So each of these impacts that you can see in the top right of your screen in the gray inset box all represent lost opportunity costs that are impacts that exist because water was being used somewhere else and couldn't drive these specific related categories. And so what that means is a single unit of water could not have driven all of those impacts together. And so simply adding them all together would lead potentially to an overstatement of the impact. So instead, what the methodology does is it sort of takes an economic approach, and it says that the preparer should take the largest of these three value factors, as this sort of represents the missed opportunity to maximize the value of that water for one of these uses. So in this example here, there's sort of this theoretical scale of these three value factors, and the altered ecosystem services is the largest, highlighted in pink. So that value factor represents the near-term impact and will get added to this future impact. And so the financial cost to access future water is distinct and added because it's taking into consideration how present impact or sort of unsustainable extraction of water leads to future challenges to access and what the financial costs of those are. And therefore it's added because it's representing a different category of impact that can co-occur with these near-term impacts as well. And so now just highlight, like the other slides did, some of our questions related to the public comments. So some of these are related to some of the things we've just presented. Similar to the OHS, we have a question about usability, and again, would love feedback about the accessibility of some of these calculations and presentation and things like that. The second question, which we haven't really highlighted here, is asking about the scope. So it's asking about water consumption as a unit. It's asking about what the boundaries of what the methodology applies to. The third question is asking about this issue of two options. So this idea that we're having a preferred option and a minimum option based on balancing this reality of data availability and local context. Question 4 is asking a little bit for feedback on some of the details around the methodological approaches. So that's not overly, we didn't overly highlight that here, but the idea of how we got to those value factors in the first place. Question 5 is asking about these other two key proposals we mentioned. So is the approach and the clarity for this local application using these freely accessible tools, does that make sense? And also this approach to aggregating impacts. And then of course there's a catch-all question like in the other ones. I'll pass it back to Dan, and I believe we have one last poll question for everyone.
Thank you, Carter. We will have 2 more poll questions. We do have one final wrap up, but for the purposes of water consumption, we do have one question as well, which is related to this proposal that was shared around really having a tiered approach to the application of the water consumption methodology, where there's a preferred and an alternative option based off of the ability to have granular data, for instance, at a location specific versus more of a national level set of water consumption data. And again, this is a question related to this point around really balancing the practicality and the feasibility of this work. I've recognized that sometimes the results of the survey are not always showing up on screen. So I'm going to try to navigate back and forth to see if that helps update things. And if not, I will continue to give the voiceover of responses. And as we are close to wrapping up our webinar, would also continue to encourage you all to share your questions in the comments, and we will follow up on them. So based off of the responses that we have right now, we have a significant number of responders indicating that both options should be included. And so that is to say that they appropriately strike this balance between feasibility and granularity. There are, again, similarly, a few comments recognizing not being sure and potentially needing a little bit more time to reflect on, which again is not surprising at all. We might receive a few more responses in there. Carter, Michael, if you have any reflections that you want to share just on that question and the responses. If not, we can move into some of the other questions that are being shared.
Yeah, I can happily just voice over this a little bit more. So, I mean, in the technical staff's assessment and sort of engagement with stakeholders, we sort of acknowledge this trade-off in this reality. And so it's encouraging to see that by and large, people in this call, for example, are acknowledging that both approaches to the methodology provide value. But again, just like everything else we've said, this is still just a proposal. And as you review the methodology, there's more feedback or nuance or comments to that, we'd certainly welcome those as well.
Great, thank you. We have two questions that have been posed. Feel free to continue to add to them. I will start with the first question. I'm going to read this pretty directly just to make sure that I capture the full idea for you all. The question is there a way for this model to incorporate, either ongoing or retroactively, examples like Maui, where the cost of water being misappropriated to golf courses and wealthy compounds was a primary factor that led to fire burning down entire towns? And so I think the sort of broader theme here is, how do these types of opportunity costs that show up, and where there's actually decisions being made about where water is being allocated to, how does that get factored into the methodology currently, or is it possible to think about how that could be factored in over time?
You want to take it, Michael, or you want me to?
I can start, and you can maybe like add on that one. So what we do is indeed like really looking at like different ways of like how that water can be used. So as Carter was describing, and like this small gray box was showing also, that we're looking at like different opportunity costs, basically. So either like water will be used in like growing food, or like in terms of the ecosystem that is like benefiting from it. And we're looking at the highest opportunity costs here of those alternatives where we can actually assess the extent of the impact. It doesn't really like distinguish at this point in time like all different possible usages of water. So we're like limiting it to like the ones where we have good understanding. But we can definitely show differences in like how the water has been used in that sense. But Carter, maybe you want to add on that one.
Yeah, I can sort of start by saying, if someone knows how much water is going into the golf course, then undeniably we could do the math to say these are the societal impacts using the proposed methodology to value those impacts. It won't directly say, like Michael's getting at, that like the water there, what are the impacts of the fire? That's sort of what would be considered something that's captured within the ecosystem services value, but wouldn't be able to be parsed out. And so what I mean by that is, basically one of the features of water not going to nature is its ability to buffer us against these extreme weather events, such as fires spreading uncontrollably. And so the ecosystem service valuation is valuing indirectly the ability of that natural area that's where the fire would have started potentially. I don't know all the details of this story. Let me just say that. So it is valuing that, but the methodology as presently presented wouldn't be able to sort of pull that out. But there is opportunity for someone to use the methodology as a starting point and be able to go deeper into those things, because there is guidance on how the value factors are calculated, how these different services, such as regulating against extreme events, sort of get incorporated. So there's potential for someone to use this as a starting point and take it a step further to some of those other aspects.
Great, thank you both. The next question is related to a similar theme that came up in occupational health and safety as well, around the implications of the potential water impacts across a global geographic distribution. And so that's to say, is there variability in the results of the water impacts for poorer countries versus richer countries? Can you share anything about both how you see that playing out and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, happy to. So the same VSL value approach that Tamsin mentioned for HS is being used in this methodology. So there's a global application of health-related impacts that doesn't take into consideration sort of richer, poorer countries in that way. But the bigger issue with water consumption isn't related to some of those financial sort of costs in and of themselves. It's related to where there's water and where there's pressure on biodiversity. So it actually, in a lot of cases, is more important. Really dry places in the methodology will have larger impacts, and really wet places will have relatively lower impacts. There's some nuance to that. So it's more important sort of the global distribution of water availability as well as sort of it sort of takes into consideration sort of infrastructure and what water is used for in different watersheds and things like that. But sort of and so that the magnitude of that basically outweighs largely any sort of reliable distributions across sort of poorer, richer countries.
Thanks for sharing that, Carter. I'm curious, is there anything that you would add related to like the human health impacts that are featured in the impact pathway, and whether there's any potential correlation there around whether health infrastructure or prevalence of disease, things like that?
Yeah, and so in those examples, some of those models for the health-related impacts take into consideration the infrastructure, as Dan's getting at, or sort of the related healthcare availability or costs. And so again, it sort of goes in the opposite direction potentially, where those are actually much larger in poorer countries, and so they sort of end up making the impacts in those countries a bit bigger. A very tangible example would be some of the waterborne disease categories are basically zeros in countries with sort of good municipal water facilities and infrastructure to clean water, and are much higher in countries where that isn't available, or more people are accessing water straight from water sources, for example. And so again, it sort of makes the impacts in those countries oftentimes a bit larger than in sort of richer countries.
Thank you. I'm going to ask, yeah, Michael, go ahead.
Maybe just to like add on that one, since I think this is like, of course, a question that is quite important. And so we also have included in the exposure drafts, like on page 40, a box really like also showing a little bit more detail on like these different elements of the valuation process, basically looking into how those are distributed, basically, and also like across countries, to get like a better feeling of that. Because often it's not necessarily, yeah, as Carter mentioned, related to the wealth of like a country, but more to the water scarcity of a country.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question before we transition into just some conclusions for our webinar, and that is to go back to some of the points that you already raised, but to help clarify and sort of emphasize this. How would you remind us of the relation between what are the data expectations for the water consumption methodology and what might be existing reporting standards, whether it's ESRS, GRI, et cetera?
Yeah, Michael, you want me to take that one? Happy to. Yeah. So for ESRS or GRI, the reporting standards are already asking for the units of meters cubed of water consumption. And so that sort of aligns with the exact unit that's being multiplied by our value factors here. Now, the added thing is in both of those situations, it's also asking for the amount of water being consumed in high water stress areas. So this would require an entity, a company, for example, to go ahead and go understand spatially on the globe where they're sort of using water in high water stress regions, sort of taken into consideration this location. The methodology we're presenting here sort of builds on that a little bit more. It says, go ahead and categorize your water consumption by location as best you can based on these two options, and use that to sort of better determine sort of your global water consumption impact.
Great. Thank you, Carter. I think that's a key component. One of the things that we're sharing here is related to sort of the very significant local context of water impacts, and the need for that sort of locally contextualized data that is building off of the reporting standards, but in some places might actually be a request for a little bit more granularity there. So Carter, Michael, anything else on this point, or anything else on water consumption before we wrap up?
Yeah, maybe to just add on that one, being aware that like, yes, there is maybe less granularity at this point in time asked for in reporting, still using the same metrics and being like consistent and aligned on that in general. But like as now also the data collection processes also will be more optimized, and like hopefully that will allow even like also way easier to like even use a more granular perspective on the water topic, especially for those entities that have that as like a material topic anyway. So to really like allow for better steering.
Thank you both. So just to turn things around to some final conclusions of the webinar. Thank you all for who have stayed on or who are listening to this recording at a later point. I want to reemphasize something that we started at the beginning, which is this is not just an informational webinar. It is a suggestion and a request for you to take this information and think about how you can provide feedback back into these drafts. And so prior to us going through a finalization of the methodologies, we are really seeking your input on the conversation that we've just shared with you all. So hopefully this gave you some important context around what's included in these proposals, as well as some food for thought in terms of what type of feedback that you might be interested in providing. I want to share a quick description of how to provide that feedback. The public comment period is running through December 7th. And so you have over a month for review and provide feedback from this date. We have, as has been highlighted, very specific questions that have been proposed for each of the methodologies. But at the same time, we also have space for anyone to provide any other feedback that they have on those methodologies as well. There is some guidance about how we would prefer the feedback to be provided. But at the end of the day, what is most important is that the feedback is being shared. And so we welcome any and all input into these drafts for our analysis. There are two primary mechanisms for you to share this feedback. The first is through a submission form that is available on each of the websites of the methodology statements. And so you're able to go through and see a direct survey with all of the questions and provide your responses directly to that. Alternately, if you would prefer to just draft a general letter and submit that letter, you are also able to do that as well. And so it's either via the form or via a more general response that you would be able to send to research@ifvi.org. You are also welcome to share any questions that you have to that same email address that we potentially haven't fully addressed here or that might come up as you're reviewing those drafts. Please feel free to reach out. And then importantly, one point of acknowledgement, as a part of our due process, the feedback that we do receive through these public comment periods is something that is shared transparently and publicly. And so you could see examples of that with some of our previous public comment periods, if you wish, where we acknowledge the feedback that's been received. And so we want to make sure that everyone is familiar with that. I also want to share, moving forward, we talked about 3 methodologies today. We acknowledge that there are many other methodologies that are actually out and available for use. We are also continually developing new methodologies. And so the nature of these public comment periods, as well as these webinars, is something that will continue through the future. And so we want to make sure that you all are aware that there will be continually new topics that are developed and proposed, and that we'd love to continue to get your feedback on. We proposed a work plan on an annual basis to that independent governance body, the VTPC. And so we are anticipating having a planned work plan for the methodology development for 2025 in the coming weeks. And so stay tuned for that so you can get a sense of the specific topics that we plan to further develop. There are a few that are currently in development, and then there will be others that will be added to that process. And overall, we encourage you all to continue to follow along, provide your feedback, and continue to support how we can improve the methodologies. And remember to think about the overall vision that we all have, which is to create that just and sustainable economy. And so I'd love to close things out with one final Menti survey, which is just what are some potential next steps for those of you who are still in the room. What would you all like to do with the exposure drafts? And so what I'm seeing is we've got some a balance of responses between going to prepare to submit feedback on the drafts, as well as to dive in and do some more reading about those methodologies. A nice balance between the two, which is appropriate and nice to hear. And so as we wrap up, I'd like to once again thank you all for attending. We really look forward to your feedback. Please reach out with any questions. And finally, I'd love to thank our speakers today, Michael, Ryan, Tamsin, Fran, and Carter. Appreciate you all taking the time to share this information. Have a great rest of your day, everybody.